Kade stood at the edge of the dock, his bright red shirt almost glowing in the morning sunlight. Behind him loomed the massive USS LST-325, a historic ship that once carried soldiers and supplies during World War II. Docked at Wheeling Heritage Port, the ship was now a museum, but today something extraordinary was about to happen. Kade had always been fascinated by the stories of the 325. His grandfather had told him tales of the brave men who had sailed it across dangerous waters, transporting tanks and troops to the front lines. It was a ship that had seen it all: war, storms, triumphs, and losses. Kade was only 5, but he felt a connection to this ship, as though it had been waiting for him. As he approached the towering steel vessel, something strange happened. The ground beneath him seemed to rumble, and a low hum filled the air. Kade stopped in his tracks, eyes wide, as the ship's engines, which had been silent, suddenly roared to life. The propellers began to spin, and the ropes that held the ship to the dock snapped loose. "Kade," a voice called from the ship. It was deep and booming, echoing across the water. Startled, Kade looked around, but there was no one in sight. The ship itself seemed to be speaking to him. "We need your help," the voice continued. "The world is in danger, and only the USS LST-325 can save it. But I can't sail without a captain. Will you lead me, Kade?" Without thinking, Kade nodded. Before he knew it, a gangplank extended from the ship to the dock, and Kade, feeling a surge of courage, sprinted aboard. The moment his foot touched the deck, the ship's engines thundered, and they were off, speeding down the river at a speed Kade couldn't believe. As they passed under the suspension bridge, Kade noticed the waters around them growing rougher. The once calm river was transforming, and before his eyes it widened into a vast ocean. Dark clouds began to gather overhead, and the peaceful landscape of Wheeling disappeared behind them. This was no ordinary journey. Something magical had taken over. "Where are we going?" Kade shouted over the roar of the engines. "To a distant island," the ship's voice replied. "A powerful enemy has awoken there, threatening to plunge the world into chaos. Only the 325 and her captain can stop them." Kade's heart pounded, but he wasn't scared. He rushed to the bridge, where the ship's old navigational equipment sparked to life, glowing with strange symbols and maps he had never seen before. On the radar, a large shape loomed in the distance, a massive island fortress surrounded by enemy ships. "Their fleet is enormous," Kade whispered, eyes wide as he studied the screen. Dozens of ships, some even larger than the 325, were stationed around the island. They were heavily armed, their cannons and turrets pointed outward, ready to attack anyone who dared approach. "Don't worry, Captain Kade," the ship's voice boomed. "We have the advantage of surprise." As they neared the enemy fleet, the 325 seemed to transform. Its old grey hull shimmered, and the cannons on board rotated, aiming at the enemy ships, and Kade could feel the ship's power beneath his feet. "Ready the weapons," Kade commanded, his voice steady despite the storm brewing overhead. With a loud roar, the 325 launched its first barrage, catching the enemy fleet off guard. Explosions rocked the water as the enemy ships scrambled to defend themselves, but the 325 was too fast, too strong. It weaved through the enemy formation with ease, dodging fire and returning its own with pinpoint accuracy. Kade's hands gripped the wheel as the ship surged forward. They were getting closer to the island fortress, but the enemy wasn't done yet. From the island, a massive battleship emerged, its guns aimed directly at the 325. "We'll have to take it down," Kade said, determination in his voice. As they neared the fortress, the battleship opened fire, a barrage of cannonballs and missiles raining down on them. The 325 dodged and weaved, but the enemy was closing in fast. Kade felt a surge of adrenaline as he directed the ship into position. "Fire!" he shouted, and the 325 responded with a thunderous volley. Its cannons unleashed a fury of explosions that lit up the sky. The enemy battleship groaned as it took hit after hit, until finally, with a deafening blast, it sank beneath the waves. With the battleship destroyed, Kade turned his attention to the island. As the USS LST-325 sailed toward the fortress, the island's defenses crumbled. The enemy forces, once so powerful, were no match for Kade's leadership and the ship's firepower. Finally, as the last of the enemy ships were destroyed, and the fortress began to fall. The storm that had raged overhead started to clear. The skies turned blue once more, and the ocean calmed. Kade stood at the bow of the ship, the wind in his face, feeling victorious. "You did it, Captain Kade," the ship's voice said softly. "You saved the world." As the 325 sailed away from the island, Kade grinned. The enemy had been defeated, the fortress had fallen, and the world was safe once more. The ocean ahead stretched endlessly, inviting Kade to explore more mysteries and adventures that lay beyond the horizon. But for now, his mission was complete. The sound of water sloshing snapped Kade out of his thoughts. He looked around, realizing he wasn't on the deck of the 325 after all. He was sitting in his bathtub, surrounded by toy boats and action figures. His fingers were wrinkled from the water, and his mum's voice echoed from the hallway. "Kade, time to get out," she called. Kade blinked, watching as his toy boat floated across the surface of the water. He picked it up, studying its shape. It wasn't the 325, but in his imagination, it had been. He smiled to himself as he remembered his visit to the ship earlier that day, the way it towered above him at Wheeling Heritage Port. The stories of its journeys and history had sparked his imagination, turning his quiet bath time into an epic adventure at sea. With a content sigh, Kade carefully placed the toy boats and action figures onto the side of the tub and climbed out, wrapping himself in a towel. As he headed for bed, his mind was already racing with new ideas for tomorrow's adventure. There were more battles to fight, more oceans to cross, and Kade, the brave captain, would be ready for them all.